Season 3 has been a narrative arc of a virtual road trip that we've been on. It started on the street, talking to some folks, asking them about how they have interacted with the church. And then we continued down to Orlando, and we had an opportunity to talk to Michael Graham about the great de-churching that's happening in America. And we've interacted with these things quite a bit. We've talked together about it. We've talked to some friends about it. And I think the next step in this conversation, the next stop on our road trip is a logical one, and that is to meet with some pastors and talk about how the church is doing, kind of take the pulse of how churches are processing this world that is in pretty extreme tension right now.
We've pulled in two different pastors. The concept here is two different denominations ministering to two parts of the city. In the inner city part, we have Reverend Matt Busby. He's from the Mission Chattanooga, and he's the senior associate pastor. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks, guys. I'm excited to be here.
The other person we have is Pastor Benjie Slaton. He's with the Grace+Peace Church. It's a Presbyterian church, and he's the lead pastor there. So welcome to you, Benjie, and he's also our pastor, so welcome.
I'm grateful to be here. This is a lot of fun.
Awesome. Why don't you get us going and tell us a little bit about your churches and what you guys are doing and focusing on. So, Matt, as the guest, why don't you get us going?
Yeah, so I pastor at an Anglican church in downtown Chattanooga, and we were planted in 2010. We didn't have any connection to Anglicanism at the time. Chris Sorensen is our founding pastor, and his wife Angie had a dream. They were pastoring in Greenwich, Connecticut at the time, and had a dream about Chattanooga. So I came down here and checked it out, felt the Lord confirm coming down here. But at the time, he wasn't Anglican at all. But he had led a Book of Common Prayer service at a congregational church up in Greenwich, Connecticut. And so the Anglicans came along and said, "Hey man, you're already doing an Anglican service. Why don't you just be Anglican?" And he said, "Okay." And so we planted as Anglican Mission in the Americas. We're now Anglican Church in North America. So all that to say, we're a liturgical, sacramental church that is still very missionally engaged within the city and contextual.
Matt, do you have an Anglican background?
I don't. I grew up Pentecostal.
Okay.
And then after college, helped plant a Baptist church, non-denom, but it was 99% Baptist.
Okay.
And my wife and I moved here a couple months after the mission was planted, but had no intention to be part of the church. Really wanted to move here and start a coffee shop. But a month before we left town, the Mission Chattanooga opened a third space coffee shop called the Camp House, and I could tell it was everything I wanted to do. And so that's how I got involved with the church and have been there ever since.
Well, it connects to a quick question for you. What do you think is, just in a phrase, what's distinctive about the mission?
I would say the two words would be contextual and liturgical. So if you come to the Mission Chattanooga and you're used to normal Anglican services, we're just a tick off from that. But if you're coming out of an evangelical, so there's this middle ground between regular evangelical churches and high church Anglicanism, and we're kind of right in between there. So if you're Anglican, you come to our church, it'll feel familiar but different. If you're evangelical and you come to our church, it'll feel different, but there's points of similarity. Like, oh, this isn't too different, too weird. I can understand this. This is interesting. That kind of thing.
Okay. All right, Benjie, we're bringing you into the conversation. So tell us a little bit about Grace+Peace and, how you guys are ministering here in Ottawa, which is hard to say sometimes for people in Chattanooga. So tell us about it. What's distinctive about Grace+Peace?
It's hard to find on the internet.
It
too.
is.
Like
it
you
is
have
hard
to type in plus, like the plus sign.
Yeah. Ottawa is a place that's not really a place.
Okay.
It used to be the seat of a county that went defunct in the 50s. And so it's like this place that people in Chattanooga are like, wait, I've heard of that. That's out there somewhere beyond the mall. My wife and I have had a long history in Chattanooga. We came out here first from Texas back when we were college students to work at a camp up on Lookout Mountain, and have always loved the city, but have lived and worked in Texas and then got the opportunity to come plant in this suburban area, and through a number of reasons decided this was the place where we needed to be. But part of the call here was the hope that we could plant a Presbyterian church. We're a PCA church that would, in a similar way, I think, to what the mission is doing, is taking a historic tradition and telling the story a little bit slant, just just a little bit off kilter in order to engage other people who are not familiar with that tradition. And we are a church that is liturgical. We're sacramental for a Presbyterian church that believes in great doctrine. We are leaning into that sacramental side of our church history. We're also a multi-ethnic church, which gives us a different style of music and just energy in the room that I think is really important and helping get into some of the themes that we're talking about today.
Welcome to A World in Tension podcast, a place where we examine the opposing pulls and struggles of life to uncover clarity, purpose, and practical solutions. Come join us as we seek to get comfortable facing the uncomfortable. This is A World in Tension.
Is it intentional in a sense that both of your churches don't mention Anglican and Presbyterian in the name?
Interesting.
Yeah, for me, that was very intentional. Mm-hmm. Chattanooga is one of the more highly churched cities, and we wanted to intentionally not identify ourselves with particular streams. We wanted people of different streams to be able to
engage and explore.
Okay. Yeah, actually, I don't know how intentional it was on our end at the beginning. Like I said, none of us were Anglican to begin with, and so we just wanted to plant a missional church in a neighborhood, and so the name Mission Chattanooga is just more rooted in that than any particular tradition that we are not claiming.
So one thing that was interesting in the Michael Graham conversation. This is the book, The Great Dechurching. We did an episode on that. If you missed it, I highly recommend going back and listening. But here's something you won't hear in the book. The ability to handle dissonance is a sign of emotional, relational, and spiritual maturity. So one of you guys is Anglican, one of you guys is Presbyterian. There's some differences there, right? So why don't we quickly point out, in case people are not familiar, what are some of those differences? And really, it's not to point them out. It's to say, can we focus on the primaries and work together or not? Because if Christians who agree on the primaries can't do it, that's a sad testament. So who wants to dive into that one? Who wants to get dissonant?
I mean, honestly, I think Benjie and I, we would probably be closer than I think most people, answering this question would be. So, he's Presbyterian, I'm Anglican. So we both believe in infant baptism. We both believe in the sacraments. Maybe there's some differences there a little bit, but really it's church government. And who cares? Who wants to talk about that?
Yeah, I actually think about an Anglican, Leslie Newbigin, who was the Bishop of India and a missiologist, and he talks about the three great streams of the church: the liturgical and sacramental stream of the church, Roman Catholic, Anglican, Orthodox threads of the church, the spiritual arm of the church, the charismatic movement, and the word, sacrament, discipline. Word typically being kind of the evangelical and I would say kind of Presbyterian Reformed world. But, those three different streams are all part of the church. And the way I navigate this is each of those three streams have something unique to give to the church that we can't be the church without those three streams. Any one of those three streams is insufficient on its own. And I think Newbigin was really helpful for me to develop a sense of, different isn't bad. In the church, that I can actually learn from these different things, and I can develop a sense of curiosity towards these other groups. And I think in some ways that's what we're trying to do as a church, is to help people who have been siloed off, and now we're seeing the fruit of that siloing in their inability to deal with dissonance, to see a broader perspective of what the church could be.
Do you both see the success of the church moving forward becoming more denominational or less denominational as time kind of moves forward here?
I'm not positive that denominations in themselves are bad. I think it's okay to have these different things, but I think you're going to see a lot more cooperation and less focusing on the distinctives and more focusing on the things that unify us.
Any other example you look at in the world, whether that's the mission field or whether that's Europe, there's a greater sense of ecumenicalism among the churches that are actually there doing work, doing mission, than what you would experience in America right now. So I think as we continue to leave Christendom, continue to enter into a secular age or whatever you want to term what we're experiencing right now, then I think that ecumenicalism will just grow.
Someone, Matt, could come on your website and see there's a female pastor, and that could instantly shut them off. So part of this question is like, where do you draw the line? There are some lines that should be drawn. Right. And I'm not necessarily making you have you make a stance on that one unless you want to. But like, some people would draw that line. And I guess part of my problem here as I look at Christianity is I feel like the line keeps moving further and further out. And so we're so isolated from one each other. I do believe there should be a line on primary issues. I think most people agree with that. But then in practice, they don't really do that. They would look at that and go, oh, definitely not. The Bible clearly says that, right? So in our culture, that is a big distinction point on both sides.
To be honest, that tension is very real within the Anglican Church. So, we even within our own denomination, there's not agreement on female ordination, female holy orders. And that there's a lot of specifics within our tradition about that. We ordain to the diaconate, we ordain to the priesthood, what is appropriate, what is not appropriate. But so there's dissonance within our own denomination about that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really hard. There are primary issues and there are secondary issues. And wisdom is knowing the difference. And it is not a sign of spiritual maturity to make all secondary issues primary issues and then to use them as a way to batter one another. We've had these denominational lines that have been inviolable, whether it's been baptism or charismatic beliefs or other kinds of things like that. And so I think the church is getting squeezed in some ways because in some ways it's becoming more ecumenical, but it's also having to respond to the pressures of the outside culture that are pressing in different kinds of ways.
Graham also talked about like how the understanding like how our brains function is important and how they had to have kind of like a pre-pastoring space for people that would, because there's so many division lines that they don't even hear you, like a different part of their brain is working. So like from a pastor's perspective of like stress and anxiety and mental health type things, like what's sort of your approach on that and philosophy of ministry to address that? I mean, do you even think that's a big deal? Are you noticing it? Walk in your shoes a little bit.
I think one of the most challenging things that I face as a pastor is the lack of awareness in our people by how much they have drunk deeply from the well of the spirit of the age. There has been such a link between cultural Christianity and American culture that many people can't figure out how to separate those two things. And that leaves them in a place where they are so stressed and anxious by what's happening in the culture that they're reading, instead of reading the culture through the lens of the gospel, they're reading the gospel and those who pastor them through the lens of the culture. I realize that what I'm saying, people are hearing from through the lens of what they saw on Tucker Carlson or on, whatever the MSNBC show is. And that is forming, or what they're watching on TikTok from some random person.
I was about to say, I wish it was that easy that
you
could identify two sources.
Right. So I'm constantly thinking about how people are going to hear what I'm saying and receive what I'm saying. And it's really hard because I find that I can't anticipate very well because whatever TikTok person is talking about now, which, I'm not watching, but it's really impacting things.
Yeah, I mean, you can't deny the fact that conversations around mental health and wellness are so in the water of our culture right now. And I'm not arguing that's a bad thing at all. We just preached about, when Jesus says, "Take up your cross and follow me." And so, what does that mean? Are we calling people to experience abuse in the name of Jesus? Like, what is the difference between putting yourself in the way of harm versus being hurt? What is the difference between sacrifice and abuse? And those are the kind of pastoral conversations we're having now in shaping a sermon. Is how do we speak truth in such a way that they'll hear it and not hear us saying something else. And so I think about what does it look like to create a church that is working out these dissonance muscles and actually building emotional, relational, and spiritual maturity. It is opening a space for them to come to you in the midst of that, right? So like we regularly will have either extra communications and emails or, following the service, like inviting people to come and talk to us. And exhibiting that as a form of what it means to be mature is that you don't then just walk away because something said that was triggering or hurt you, but it is a moment to open conversation. And if you can do that, that is one of the best windows for discipleship in this moment.
But one of the challenges that I find is that requires trust and it requires relationship, which is the very thing that people are less and less able to do because of because of just the way that culture is, the isolation, the loneliness, the anxiety that is keeping people from being able to build those thick relationships. And so, I think we're operating on a lot on the front end of that in trying to help people begin to build those relationships. But one of the challenges that I feel personally is how do we then take those relationships and help people share their stories in a deep way so that the relational bonds, the foundation of relationships, can then be built into this to really address some of these dissonance muscles.
Bonhoeffer believed that tribalism was a problem. Life together as believers is so important. We've got to break people out of this tribalism, whether it's a denomination or something that's anxiety laden in the news cycle or whatnot. We have to be working to help people kind of get out of their comfort zone and see that people that hold slightly different opinions on subjects are not the enemy. They just have slightly different opinion.
Yeah, and Benjie, you were talking about a thick culture, which, Matt, you have a pretty cool story in terms of this the whole third space concept of using the church throughout the week. And how does that help build thickness in kind of the culture of the people, not only in that are ministering, but those in the community? Like, how does that help?
Yeah, so when the Mission Chattanooga was planted, Chris had a vision of wanting to be in a downtown neighborhood, but didn't sit empty 6 days a week, but was part of the life of the community, right from the get-go. And I think why that idea is so attractive is because so much of the rest of our lives we see and we naturally experience as being segregated, right? I have my work life, I have my work friends, I have my church life, my church friends, I have my neighborhood, my street. And I think what's beautiful about a church that will plant a third space that is actively involved in the neighborhood and making it a sacred space on Sundays is it really actually helps overcome a lot of those natural divisions, right? And so what we ended up doing at the Mission is, the number one way that our church grew is because people came to the camp house first. And what's so beautiful about that is the fact that there's so many barriers to entry around church that most people don't think about. And we don't think about it, again, because of Christendom. Like, everybody knows what it feels like to go to church. But if you've been out of the church for 10, 15 years, it can be extremely intimidating of knowing where to park. It could be feel really weird to shake somebody's hand. Why is this person happy to see me when I walk in the door? I can't remember what sociologist it was, but they said when unchurched people think about what's weird about church people think that it's the offering. And that's not the case at all. Anybody will say, yeah, you're a nonprofit, you need money. I get it. It's the Christian karaoke they find weird. It's the singing worship songs together, because that doesn't really happen anywhere else other than concerts,
Soccer games, come on.
In soccer games, this is why this is all right.
But you don't walk into Lowe's and people are shaking your hand like, let's sing together.
Yeah,
What?
There was a songbook, a CFC songbook. I had it for a while. So.
Okay, but so the camp house though is a coffee shop, right? Originally.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the most beautiful thing about the way this worked is the fact that when you did decide to come to church on a Sunday for the first time, not only were you already comfortable and familiar with the space, but more than likely you walked in and you already had relationships with people in the room because you had come to the coffee shop 2 or 3 times. I used to tell people the best part about my job was going from serving somebody coffee on a Monday to serving them communion on a Sunday. And that was just a really special experience. Yeah. And so we embedded ourselves within downtown Chattanooga in a really special way that I'm not sure is possible otherwise, especially for a church that was so new to the city and to the community.
I mean, so let's make a connection point. How would us out in the suburbs, and many, come into that environment, right? Like we don't have a 6-day-a-week building, because part of this is, how do we discuss partnership? Do you look at other churches and how that works, or is it sort of like, this is our mission community, right? Either of you can comment on that.
Well, I do want to point out, like, the camp house is also the reason why the mission has had so many incredible ecumenical relationships in Chattanooga. I mean, it's how I know Benjie. It's from Benjie coming in to get a cup of coffee, and I get to sit and get to know him.
Interesting,
right? So just these low key, low barrier ways of forming relationships are just key to community. And I think it does speak to this whole dissonance problem. Like, we don't do well with dissonance because we're actually not good at making relationships anymore.
Yeah, I think that's right. Because, relationships that can handle dissonance. I've been thinking about, like, what are some of the characteristics of a relationship that can handle that dissonance? Like, what are the virtues of a person who can handle that? Well, curiosity, asking good questions, not even good questions, but any questions. I think the courage to step into the unknown space, which, I just think is a real challenge these days. People just do not want to step into something new. I think a humility that is able to see people and value them. I think there's a graciousness that overlooks the foibles and failures and kinds of limitations of people. And those are the kind of virtues and attributes that I just don't think we see as much of without some of this rubbing shoulders. One of the things that I would tell people I loved about being in Austin was all the weirdos. Keep Austin weird is the motto. And it was one of the most fun things, just the kind of bizarre people that you would run into. I loved it. It was energizing to me. Compare that to, I had a conversation, I was with a group of friends in my neighborhood. We have a monthly whiskey night, and a guy that only one of us knew came, and he was new to Chattanooga, and he had moved from the West Coast, and he said, I love being in Chattanooga because I feel confident that everybody around here is like me. Oof. And I was like, that is so interesting, that part of the motivation was to get away from people who were different from me in order to be around people who are like me, which, feeds into the big sort and all the kinds of sociological things that are happening in our culture. But I thought that was a really interesting articulation of it.
One theme that keeps coming back up is the fact that churches need to disciple well, that's not really done, especially if churches get big, that tendency becomes harder. And then also sort of this balance between a confessional and a missional church, right? Like, so we're very confessional. We believe the doctrines, the liturgies, all that stuff. Or missional, I want to get out in the community and serve. And usually one gets lost for the other. It's like a scale where you're putting more on than the other. So what are your thoughts on either of those topics, discipleship and its importance of it, but also how do you do this confessional and missional thing well, and why is that so challenging?
I really like the way that Ray Ortlund talks about this, and I'm not sure where he got it from, but he talks about, instead of confessional and missional, he talks about gospel doctrine and gospel culture, and I think it's a distinct or a different kind of tension that he's putting there, because he's not trying to balance those two priorities. What he's saying is you have to have a robust doctrine. You have to have a confessional environment where you're teaching God's word, you're teaching the truths of our tradition. This is where the particularities of a particular tradition get maximized and explained and understood and lived in, whether it's Anglican or Presbyterian or whatever. But then that has to be married with a full gospel culture where the gospel of Jesus is becoming the thing that is animating our relationships and our worship and how we're doing everything. It's more about we're doing gospel doctrine, but in a way of gospel culture, so that those two things are not set at odds against one another, but they are the same. They are partnered together. And so a gospel culture, though, both is good for the person who's in the room, for the person who is called a Christian, because they become more and more like Jesus. But it's also good for the person who is not in the room, and because they are drawn in by the beauty and the grace and the loveliness and the humanity of the gospel. And so I think that breaks down that missional, which is always set in tension with, are we worried about discipleship or mission? Well, no, we're actually worried about becoming more like Jesus, who never felt that tension. You never see in the Gospels that he feels like, well, now I've got to, really focus on my disciples, and then I'll worry about you other people later. Those two things were always married. And so Ray Ortlund says when you have gospel doctrine and gospel culture, you have spiritual power. That's where the church becomes an agent of the kingdom.
I feel like we have like a truncated doctrine of God when we don't think about missional theology and the fact that the third person, the Holy Spirit, is out in front of you at all times and in all places, that you're never going to have a conversation with somebody where the Holy Spirit has already been active in that person's life and is doing something in them. So I do think that's one part that's really important. But the thing that keeps coming to my mind too is I'm pretty influenced by a guy named James Davison Hunter, who wrote a book called To Change the World. And the title of the book is completely tongue-in-cheek, because he's basically saying you're not called to change the world. You're called to be faithfully present where God has placed you. And I'm going back to what I said earlier about the way in which we've compartmentalized our lives, and have become okay with that. Even as cultural nominal Christians, we become okay with that in such a way that we are able to go to church on Sunday, and then go to work, and then go to soccer practice, and then go to our neighbor's barbecue. And we don't see that as an integrated experience as followers of Jesus. Getting Christians to understand their embodied presence within a community, I think, is really, really important. Because once you get beyond that, some of the big ideas, it's so easy to become idealistic when you're not in a relationship with other people. And I think the biggest problem we have is we're literally not in relationship with people who are different from us.
Are we then trying to take on the role of the church at too large of a scale? In the sense, are we trying to reach people in mass with some message that we think is going to change a lot of individuals, when in reality it's one person at a time? Maybe as churches, as we discuss like what it is that we're trying to do collectively, that the individual is, considered instead of the message.
Yeah, I think the way I would want to put it is that it's the gospel is not less than individuals, but it is more than individuals. Mm-hmm. And so like our witness as the church shouldn't just be about individual salvation and changing hearts and minds. Our witness as the church should be towards a human flourishing that is the kingdom to come, right? And so the best way I can think to describe this is like, what is a great witness? Let's just take, we were talking about ecumenicalism earlier, right? It would be a great witness to the world. Jesus even told us this: they will know you by my love. So it would be a great witness to the world for the church to be unified and deeply ecumenical. What I think is extremely powerful and what we are called to is to do that in Chattanooga, not necessarily trying to form relationships between Canterbury and Rome in my case, right? But it is actually important for me, knowing the brokenness of Chattanooga, to unite my church with Grace+Peace, with the Catholic Church, with the Pentecostal churches, to work towards shalom and flourishing in Chattanooga. And that would be an incredible witness, not just individuals in Chattanooga, but to institutions, to structures, to everything the gospel wants to speak to.
We are the church, right? We individually make up a church. So how much of the role is it on sort of organically doing stuff, inviting people to our tables to eat at our homes, versus how much structure you put up in churches, and how do you balance that, right? Because it all fits together. And I mean, I think that's probably a struggle you guys feel as pastors. Like everyone's kind of coming around every corner going, what you need to do is like open a gym to your church, just to throw myself under the bus. But I'm sure people are coming with you with countless ideas, right? So how do you navigate that with what you just said, Matt, about how it integrates together with even different institutions?
I think as leaders in the church, we have to be the most adept at using our dissonance muscles. We've got to be the people that are not operating out of our own anxiety and stress. And we've got to be the people who are, exercising some of that gospel maturity and hearing, being curious, not dismissing ideas, figuring out where that comes from, and sometimes giving people the opportunity to try things that we don't think are going to work, but because, God may be gifting them to do that thing, but also being able to draw clear boundaries and to do that in a way that is helpful. I think leadership is really important and really hard, because I'm just as anxious as everybody else. I'm feeling the stress just like everybody else. I'm not immune to that. But we can't live, lead out of that reactivity.
So coming back to the main question of season 3, which is how do we effectively live as a collective church body in today's world in tension? I mean, this is largely about, we're getting the pastor's perspective, right? So like, what do you want the congregation to know about that? Like what would you want, how would you want to encourage them that? And obviously you're doing that week on week, right? But what maybe are they missing from their perspective as a congregant?
That's such a difficult question, which is why I think both Matt and I have the tendency to read these books by these like philosophical guys, and maybe even some of our conversation is in the clouds a little bit, because I think that's what we're all wrestling with, is that the models of doing church, whether it was the models, at least in my case, in the Reformed and Presbyterian world, the models of the Reformation and the Puritans and, American evangelicalism are not, that kind of discipleship is not what we need. We need something that is more rooted. And so I think actually, going back to the earlier church is more helpful. But to articulate that in, 3 or 4 points, I think it would be great if our people were more aware of what they were doing online. Yeah. I think it'd be great if they were more curious and courageous in talking to people who are different from them and engaging people who are different from them and inviting them into their worlds. I think it'd be amazing if we could develop a more prayerful, not just private prayer, but corporate place where, before we got on, Matt was super inspiring, talking about some work that they're doing with vocation, but helping people see their vocation as holy and a service to God, whether it's in medicine or education or finance or whatever it is. I think those kinds of things, to see the whole of their life as an act of worship.
Well, you said you didn't, it was too difficult, but those are great answers. Those are really fantastic, practical answers. And I want to come back to what does the early church look like, but
yeah,
Matt.
I can tell you what I'm worried about, and then we can backtrack into an answer. How about that?
I like that.
Benjie said it. He's very worried about people's relationship to being online, because I don't think people understand how much it trains them not to notice the world around them, which is where God has placed them, right? Embodiment in a place is part of what it means to be human. It's part of God's design for who we are, is to be present right here. And what investment in social media does is it teaches us to pay attention to things that are way outside, that are not local, that are not right here.
So are you most concerned with their intake and how, or just the fact that they're just so distracted? Like, and how would you remedy that, right? Like, how do you want them to be less distracted? Because I know that's a topic with even them within our own families, right? Like everyone's struggling with that. So what does more physical look like? Yeah. How do we do it?
Well, I actually do love the fact you brought up your family, and I do think that's where it starts. Andy Crouch has done so much incredible work of challenging Christian families to examine how they're engaging technology and how it's separating them from each other within their own homes. And so I think it has to start there, and not just with families, but honestly, like if you are a follower of Jesus who is single and living with a roommate, your relationship and what you're creating in that home should be different as well. And so I do think it starts there. But like I said, my biggest concern is that if we're constantly being distracted by online things or things that are very disembodied and kind of out there in the culture, right? In air quotes, just out there. How do you love? What does love look like? What does it mean to follow the great commandment we were talking about earlier? And I think that becomes an extremely hard thing to answer. And I want people to be attentive to the place in which God has placed them and be responsible to the loves that they're directly attached to. So that's my biggest concern. I think the other thing I'm very concerned about too is just comfort. Like, we are so good at comforting ourselves. And I mean, you could argue this is why social media is so popular. But what does it mean to sacrifice for the sake of your neighbor? Mm-hmm. You know, I don't, that's really difficult.
Mm-hmm. We talk about that as a virtue, sacrifice. I would say one of the weaknesses of our church is actually figuring out how to put that into practice.
Yeah.
Well, so coming back to the comment of the early church model, you know, some people may take that to the like home church, you know, just do home churches, and then we spread city to city, right? You know, because I think some of these bigger churches, mega churches, it's like, hold on, we're paying a ton of money for like the production element of it. This is about people's lives. So I don't know. Is there something you want to unpack there? Or?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think it is a, you know, not just to say that big is bad or something, because I think God uses large churches and movements, and I'm grateful for that. Big churches can do things that churches our size just can't do.
That's right.
So it's not just that, but there is a depersonalization in that larger environment that is, they're playing on some of the large cultural movements in order to create a buy-in. But I also think, so there is simplicity in the early church that you see. I think you also see a relationship to the prevailing culture. The early church was okay seeing themselves as a faithful minority, as a remnant, as a group that had to be bound together, that what held them together was stronger than the forces that would push them apart in the culture. I think we need a healthy dose of that in the Western church, I should say. I also think that they were passionate about loving people. You see the ways that they cared for the sick and the lonely and the oppressed, and they weren't working within justice systems. You know, they were working, on the ground, the actual ways that they sacrificed for other people. We need a healthy imagination. Our imagination as American Christians, at least I'll say this, in the suburbs of a place like Chattanooga, is really dominated by the kind of revivalism and the megachurch movement of the last 50 years. We don't have an imagination for what God might do in a different kind of context, and so we tend to judge everything against those expectations. So I feel like our church is attempting to kind of play off of of what people's expectations are and give a taste of that, and to do some of the programs and meet some of those expectations while trying to change the expectations. I don't know how successful we'll ever be at that, but I think that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, I want to bring us to a close here by asking about the thickness of the church culture and really how that's perceived at an intuitive level. So again, coming back to our conversation with Michael Graham, he said a church community that is intellectually, emotionally, and missionally engaged will be a thicker community, and that will kind of exist at an intuitive level. So it's almost hard to like pin down exactly what that is, but you know it when you see it, sort of thing.
So what I love about this question is it's an ecclesiological question, right? Like, this is a question of what is the church? And I do think that is a really important question for us to ask moving forward, because evangelicals who are on their way out of the church will walk into our service and discover something, in your language, thick, and it's something richer, more rooted, more sacramental than what they had experienced before, and they stay, right? And that's because we believe that what happens in church is not just a place where I go and express my faith and it improves my personal relationship with Jesus. It's because we actually believe, the church itself is a sacrament. It is a place where we meet with God as the body of God. It's not just me and God. It's actually our community. There's something happening in our gathering. And so we're saying liturgies and prayers that are hundreds of years old. Like, I'm being connected to a story that helps root my identity as a follower of Jesus in more than just the gospel, but it's actually the way the church has lived for the last 2,000 years, right? And then we come together every week around communion, and this is something that's just so important, because I believe in what's called the doctrine of the real presence, that when we take communion together, God is present and he is doing something, right? We don't define how he's present, but he says he's going to be there, right? And I'm just going to have faith that that's true. And so there's a thick identity that's being shaped on Sunday that then can send me out into the world in a way that I don't know that I experienced as a young Christian.
Well, and maybe this gets to what I was saying a minute ago about imagination and the vision of something bigger, because worship forms us.
Yes. Yeah, James K. Smith says it's a place where we're reformed.
We're reformed,
every week.
Right.
Yes.
And I think a lot of our traditions have been just focused on the intellectual side, at least in the kind of Reformed and Presbyterian world, Bible church world even. But right there, that's the three streams of Leslie Newbegin to bring it back around. And I think worship is a place where we become more fully human, intellectually, emotionally, relationally, where our imagination is shaped. And so I think you're right. And we're seeing the same kinds of things at our church. People are coming and they've not been in a church where they've even done communion every week. And they're like, wow, I don't know why that's important to me, but that feels really important to me because now they're being brought into something that's bigger than themselves. I think that's one of the best things we can proclaim in the Western world right now, is that you are not the center of the world. Jesus is.
Yes.
And he's been doing this a lot longer than you've been around, and he's going to be continuing to do it a lot longer than you're here. And your moment in time is not the most central thing. Yeah. And that sense of kind of, epistemological humility.
Yes. Love that phrase.
Is so helpful for people to realize, well, okay, this moment, maybe this isn't the biggest election we'll ever face. Maybe there have been more important things that have happened in the world.
Yes.
And we are playing a role. And that doesn't mean that God doesn't care about us. It means that God cares about us even though we're not the most important thing.
Yeah.
And he sent his son to die for us, to redeem us, to make us people who look like his son. And he is at work now, and he has not left us alone. And I think that is a completely reforming
and I just love to talk about church as being a place where we are reformed, because what that is intuitively saying is that the world around you is forming you and shaping you in some way. And if you're not aware of that, then it's not clear how you should be actually formed into the likeness of Christ. If you don't see the ways in which we were talking about social media, it's not just social media. It's the way your phone makes you the center of the universe. And you're on that all the time. It is shaping a certain way of vision of what it means to be human, which is inevitably going to shape what it means to follow Jesus. And so we just have to be aware of ways in which the world is shaping us. And then what does it mean to follow Jesus in that? How can the church be reforming us to follow Jesus? And guess what? The church's history has can tell us a whole lot about how we should be formed into following Jesus.
Yeah, I think that's well said.
That's a beautiful way, I think, of expressing the original question, which is, how does the church engage in this world in tension? And I think you guys have both summed it up well in that last question. So thank you guys for sitting down with us. Both of you, talked about the importance of communion each and every week. And I think that's a really beautiful thing that the world could really benefit from. I mean, is that weekly communion with other individuals. And I think that's a beautiful picture of one of the things that we as the church have to offer to the world, is something bigger than us. It's how we fit in corporately. And I think communion is really probably one of the most richest ways that we could do that. So I think that's a beautiful thing to end on.
So thanks again, guys, for joining us. And thank you, listener, for joining us for another episode of A World in Tension.